So technology prediction is hard. And it's not just Brin and Page who were kind of suspicious of advertising for search. In fact, I've been collecting information. At that stage, the dominant search engine was Alta Vista, and wasn't doing very well business in terms of business revenues. And in general, the consensus was that search was not a viable business. I mean, you can see it. Both Microsoft and Yahoo outsourced their search functions. That's kind of bookkeeping. We've got to have it. It's a feature that our users demand, but it doesn't matter. And also, online advertising was being given up as useless. Yeah, today it's a great success. So it's hard to predict. And part of the difficulty is you're talking about, on one hand, unknown developments in technology, and second, you're also talking about unknown reactions from human society. What will people do with the technology? And what we observe over and over again is that even the inventors and promoters of new technologies do not understand beforehand, or very often even later, what it is that society wants from their inventions. I mean, many examples, maybe I'll cite some of them later. Now, in terms of prediction, one of the reasons that we had this very destructive, financial real estate bubble is that our kind of economic policy leaders consciously adopted the view that bubbles cannot be predicted, cannot be identified, and cannot be deflated. Ben Bernanke, the current head of the Federal Reserve, published an influential set of papers with their collaborator Mark Gertler, where they did some mathematical modeling, and they also, one of the conclusions was, monetary authorities should simply wait for bubbles to collapse. When they do collapse, and mark it up with easy money policy. They should not try to intervene with bubbles. I think his actions last couple of years disprove that. So he has not publicly recanted, has not withdrawn the claim in the paper. And Alan Greenspan still defends himself. And I claim that's false. There's quite clear evidence that some bubbles can be identified and have actually been identified in the past. So, again, I will not cover all the points I mentioned earlier in detail. We don't have much time, but let's get into the British railway mania. So here is a chart showing the kind of speculative excitement. So railways require, or practically all railways required Act of Parliament, which enabled the promoters to use the right of eminent domain to acquire land from landowners, whether they wanted to sell or not. Okay? So promoters would go to Parliament, and Parliament would hold hearings and would approve some proposals and reject others. This chart shows mileage authorized by the British Parliament each year, from about 1833 to about 1850. So the great railway mania, was the one you see to the right, the big spike in the kind of mid-1840s. 1845, 46, and 47, you have giant promotions and huge mileage that's authorized. Not all of these lines are get built. Some of the promoters give up as time goes on, but I mean that shows you how much interest there was about building new railways. And this promotion, now the actual construction followed later and was spread over a number of years, and was followed by a crash. So you can see that in 1850 nobody wants to build new railways. Parliament isn't authorizing any more mileage because no promoters are going, practically no promoters are coming to them for such permissions, and that's because everybody is suffering. And by everybody, I really mean just about everybody. If you read letters of Charlotte Brand, she and her other sisters invested most of their money in railways and were suffering very badly. Charles Darwin invested in railways quite a bit of money. John Stuart Mill was an investor. Charles Babbage was an investor. Some other people did not seem to be investors directly, but were heavily involved. Herbert Spencer, one of the kind of great philosophers, or very important philosophers of the 19th century, he was a railway engineer. He probably didn't have money to invest, but he worked on railways in that period, at the beginning of his career. Charles Dickens, So that he does not, as far as we can tell, he did not invest in railways. On the other hand, his career took a sudden detour because he was hired to be editor of a new newspaper, daily newspaper, or daily news, which was funded largely with money coming out of railways, and one of whose main purposes was to promote railway industry. And so, I mean, lots and lots of people, politicians too, just about any influential politician of that era that you can name was involved in with railways one way or another. So it's a really, really big factor in the economy. Okay? And it was giant. There's no technology mania like that I can find in history that compares. If you think about the investments as a fraction of total economy, so it's a fraction of GDP. So the two British railway manias of the there are really two manias. I'll come back later and talk about the smaller railway mania of the 1830s, which is actually a very interesting one. There's practically nothing about it in the literature. Okay? In particular, people seem to have never recognized that it was a successful mania. It is possible to have a giant, wildly speculative mania that's successful, and the one example I know, really the only one I know, is the railway mania of the 1830s. Okay. But anyway, so there's a mania in the 1830s, there's a mania in the 1840s. The one of the 1840s is a disaster. There are certainly good arguments to be made that it was very good for British society. That was actually, that was provided that, so even though it ruined people like the Bronte sisters and many other investors, that it provided offsetting gains for society as a whole. There are arguments that it may have saved Britain from a revolution in 1848 as well, somewhat speculative in that case, but definitely to ruin investors. So by 1850, nobody wants to build railways. But earlier there was great excitement. And total investment, this is real investment. So I'm not talking about kind of money being paid for shares, the money simply changing hands from one pocket to the other, but rather the money that's actually invested. So in the case of the internet bubble in the United States, total real investment was very small. It was really amazingly small. You're talking about maybe $200 billion, maybe 2% of GDP. Okay. There are huge valuations. Cisco being valued at $600 billion, but that's simply kind of valuations of stock that's already out there, money changing hands from one pocket to another. So the real investment, the money spent digging the ditches to put down fiber, to pay the software writers to create new programs, to pay for the bandwidth, to send out the video to consumers, that was very, very low. In the case of railways, it was different. Investments were gigantic. The United States also had gigantic investment in the 19th century. Actually, 19th century is the century of railways. All countries spend a lot of money on railways. However, in the United States there are various bubbles, much smaller ones, largely because the United States railway investment has heavy government involvement. We don't have the giant capital resources of Britain. You don't quite have the same kind of dynamics of free capitalism. So, which is one of the reasons that British railway manias are so interesting. So anyway, so they invest about 40% of GDP in those two manias over a period of about 15 years. This is about 40% of GDP. It's about $6 trillion for the United States now. The Obama administration economic stimulus program is $787 billion spread over 2 years. So you're talking about, over these 2 years, about $400 billion per year. At the peak, the Brits were spending about 1.2 trillion, equivalent of about $1.2 trillion per year. Gigantic investment. And this is all coming from private investors, pursuing private profit, okay, and building out the public infrastructure. Well, there's simply so much excitement about it.